So tonight we're going to talk about mindfulness. This seems like a very easy topic, or a lot of people might know about this in Buddhism. As Marina said, I am a psychotherapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, so my first introduction was actually through psychology. So tonight our talk is going to be kind of bridging the gap between those two worlds and how they fit together. So in the last few years, obviously it's become pretty popular, the self-help movement. There's lots of books on mindfulness. If you go to Barnes & Noble, you can see them everywhere. So probably most people have heard of mindfulness at this time, and I thought it would be really beneficial to introduce this in our Living Theosophy series because it's very accessible, very popular right now. So a few years back, I went to a training, and that was my first introduction to mindfulness. And so I only learned about it as a therapeutic technique. I had really no concept that it was something spiritual or connected to Buddhism. And as I was learning the techniques, I thought, this kind of makes sense. I get it, but something was missing, and it didn't really all fit together for me. So when I tried to use it with my clients, I didn't quite understand how it all fit together. So then, of course, I come to the Theosophical Society, where you find all the answers to your burning questions in life. And as I started learning more and more about theosophy, I found many things that overlap with psychology. The first one was Thought Forms by Annie Besant. It's straight up cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. It's pretty amazing. That's another talk, though. So as I've been learning more and more about mindfulness, I've really noticed that with the background of Buddhism, I understand how to apply it with regular people every day, how to manage our emotions, and then reach spiritual enlightenment. So let's go ahead and look at our two definitions of mindfulness. The first one we've heard, well, some of you might have heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn. He really popularized mindfulness in the psychology field back in the 70s. Last summer, we had one of his students or colleagues here with us talking about mindfulness, and he did a great job. They've really focused on stress reduction and how to manage your emotions. That's where the psychology field takes it. In the 90s, Marsha Linehan came around, and she started applying mindfulness to the most difficult to treat clients that were considered untreatable. She applies mindfulness, and suddenly they're making huge leaps in their ability just to manage their emotions every day. So looking at Jon Kabat-Zinn, his definition is paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally as if your life depended on it. So to break it down, paying attention on purpose. This describes an intention. You're going in saying, I'm going to really focus on this and be present in this moment. So it's not an idle process. I'm doing this on purpose. In the present moment, I'm only focusing on right now, not what I did 5 minutes ago, not what's going to happen in 5 minutes, just right now. That's the only focus of my concentration. Non-judgmentally. That's probably one of the hard things for a lot of us, and that's one of the key parts of the psychological definition of mindfulness. Being able to accept something as it comes up without labeling it, defining it, addressing it as good or bad, or making a judgment about it. So just no assessment or analysis of what it is, just awareness of what comes up. He thought that was a good enough definition. Then he decided, nope, as if your life depended on it. That was necessary and very important, he thought, for the definition, because it keeps you focused very much that, again, it's not an idle process. This is something you have to do. Singular focus, all attention on one thing, as if your life depended on it, so that you can really focus and remove all distractions and just have pure awareness left. So very clinical definition in that sense. We look at the Buddhist definition, it's a little more simple. An instant awareness of an object before you recognize, label, or identify it. So thinking about this, what's that feeling you have when you see something before you actually put a name to it or describe it or understand fully to really think about what it is. When you have a feeling of hunger, for example, that feeling comes up in you. You feel it before you hear your stomach rumble, before you say, I'm hungry, and before you decide, I need to go eat. That first feeling is the awareness. That's what we're trying to get at with mindfulness. So trying to get away from all those distractions and everything of whether this is good or bad. Should I be eating? Should I not? Is it time to eat? Just feeling the feeling and being with it. Meditation also talks about the gaps between thoughts. So when we have that feeling of hunger, we don't yet have a thought. We were thinking about whatever we're doing in the moment. Now we're thinking about eating. Somewhere in there, there was a gap of just that feeling of hunger before I realize I'm hungry. In meditation, we're constantly trying to elongate those gaps. So to be able to just be aware without thinking, labeling, defining things as something specific. One example is here, we have this wonderful table. But as you see, I look at it and I've already decided it's a table. But to break it down, there's a top, it's round, there's 4 legs. Things go on top of it. It's about, knee high. It must be a table. So in cognitive psychology, they really break that down to say, they've really studied this in depth of how we recognize, label, and define things. So I don't just see a table and automatically know a table. I have to think through all these processes of 4 legs, top, all these things connect. In my brain, suddenly a picture and the word comes up of table. That happens in nanoseconds. Like, we don't even know we're doing that. It's so instantaneous. I see it, you're a table. So that's where we talk about those gaps in between thoughts. There's no gap. It's a nanosecond between you, table. I know what that is. When I was in California last month, this was a good example. So thinking about when you see something new, there's a longer gap because you don't know what it is. I saw this cactus flower, which I don't actually know what it is, so that's what I'm calling it. And I went to look at it, and I'm looking and said, okay, the petals come apart, and it's got a bloom in the middle, and it keeps going out, so it looks like a flower. But the petals are really thick, like a cactus. And as I'm sitting there examining it and thinking about what it could be, I'm in the awareness of just in awe of this plant that I've never seen before without having to find or label, what species or whatever it is, or make up a name for cactus flower. It just is what it is. So in that moment, I'm able to have some awareness and connection with this object because I've never seen it before. I don't have any labels or things to go along with it. Buddhism then takes this another step further to look at our table and then look at all of the interconnections and to make that connection of universal oneness. So in psychology, we want to see, how do we know this is a table? In Buddhism, they say, oh, this isn't just a table. This is wood that came from a tree that came from a forest really far away. This is a table that belongs to the Theosophical Society. So now the Theosophical Society is part of this table. This talk and me are now part of this table because I'm talking about it. Then we have to consider who put the table up here for this presentation. They are now part of the table. The carpenter, the glue, the nails, anyone who has had any contact with this table is part of this table. This table could not exist without the forest, the carpenter, the people who take the forest down, whoever varnished it, whoever created the varnish, whoever put it up here. All of us are part of this one table. So in psychology, we're looking at like, oh yes, I understand it's a table because it's got 4 legs. Buddhism gives us that other side to say, it's not just a table. We're all connected. And that's the purpose of mindfulness in Buddhism, to understand how me and this table are really all part of the universal oneness. Okay, so we have our 2 definitions. The big difference that I notice between them is that in psychology, it's really focusing on the technique, using mindfulness to get through daily life. Whereas in Buddhism, it's about the experience. Feeling like me and this table are one. Feeling that you and I are one. Feeling myself connected to the whole universe and not feeling all that separateness. Ego. Ego is one of those things we talk about in meditation of, well, the whole purpose is to overcome your ego, tear it down, get to egolessness. So the question arises, why should we build the ego up if we just have to break it down? Everyone that I see, or the reason you go to psychotherapy, is to build up your ego. All of our techniques and theories is about building the ego. Well, wouldn't it be a whole lot easier if you said, hey, you don't already have an ego? Great! Start meditating, you're halfway to enlightenment. Right? Makes sense. No. Mark Epstein, he wrote a couple different books on Buddhism and psychotherapy, and he brought up this question. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And so he started kind of talking about if you have poor ego strength, which is something we say in psychology of you don't have a solid ego, you don't know yourself, you're not well grounded, and you start to move into meditation, terrible things can happen. Often you might have, or not often, but sometimes you might have a psychotic break. So in this way, I kind of looked at it as the involution from spirit into matter. We have to build up our personal ego here on the spiritual plane, on the physical plane, not the spiritual plane, in the matter, so that then we can evolve out of matter and up into spirit. So we absolutely have to build that ego up before we can take that next step to become spiritual. So what would happen if you don't? I mean, obviously you said you might have a psychotic break. That's kind of scary. But thinking about it too, Theosophy refers to the Upanishads and how they really separate the real from the unreal. So if someone is not very grounded, they do not have a strong personal ego, and they are kind of in their own little world, they start meditating, they get to the point where they think they're enlightened, everything's wonderful, I know so much, but what they're really doing is pushing themselves further into the unreal. So they're getting so caught up here in this physical plane that they're believing this world is real. Whereas if you can have that strong ego to start with and realize this here isn't real, then as you go further into mindfulness and meditation, you can push past into the real. Does that all make sense? It's kind of a heady topic there, but it's the whole idea we've got to come down into matter, embrace our personality and ego, so that then we can overcome it. So a lot of people, will talk about seeing colors or hearing messages and noises during meditation and how it must mean that they're really getting close to enlightenment. No, they're getting closer to being deluded into thinking they're getting towards enlightenment. I mean, I'm not an expert on meditation. Maybe some colors do come up at some point, but that's what happens for a lot of people. They get into this delusion of, I'm doing really well, look at me, feeding into that ego, instead of really learning how to be grounded and separate physical plane from spiritual. So, most meditation teachers often talk about the different dangers and cautions of getting into meditation too soon or doing it too often or too much. Some people say, I meditate 5 hours a day and I have all these great experiences. That might be a little too much. So it's important to do everything in moderation, know exactly what you're doing. So the goal for psychology really in mindfulness is to strengthen the ego. That's what psychology uses mindfulness for, strengthen the ego. So that then, when your ego is solid, you can continue the same practice and move on to now overcome the ego. It's a pretty great system you can stay with the whole way through from novice to the end of your life. I wouldn't say expert because I don't know if there's ever an expert. So let's talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. First one is body, feelings, mind, and dharma. We'll start here with the body. So this is kind of the basic, where everybody starts with meditation. The first thing to talk about are the breath and the postures. You can do meditation sitting, which is the traditional way, standing, so I could be meditating right here, or walking. Those are often recommended if you're feeling extra sleepy. That will hopefully keep you awake from not falling asleep. Or you can actually do it lying down, more likely to get you to fall asleep, but you can try it. So those are the 4 basic postures. Breath and postures. And the breath is really just focusing on the sensation that you feel. So initially in mindfulness, you're really just noticing the inhale, the air coming in through your nose, feeling it in your nostrils, filling up your lungs, and exhaling back out. In a nutshell, that's mindfulness. Sounds really easy. And it has all these great benefits. Who knew? So as we're noticing my abdomen expands and contracts, I start to notice the relationship between the breath and the rest of my body. So I start to notice my heart rate starts to slow down, my stomach expands or my chest expands, depending how I'm breathing. Am I breathing too fast? Am I breathing too slow? Is it heavy, shallow? All those things we start to notice, okay, this breath has a relationship to me and an importance to my body. Then you can push it further. The breath is also very similar to a lot of things in nature. One book that I was reading about talked about, as we see often in winter, the expanding and contracting of the roads that make so many potholes. It's very similar to the expanding and contracting of our chest when we're breathing. I always think of breathing in regards to the ocean. Whenever I go to the ocean, it sounds like the whole earth is breathing to me. You have the inhale where it's coming up, and then it goes out and in and out. I think that's why so many people love the ocean, because it's so natural and it really connects us to know I am part of this world. We are all one. The world, the earth, breathes the same way my little body does. So another way to see that universal oneness. Buddhism also breaks it down into the rising moment, the enduring moment, and the passing moment. I thought this was really interesting in the idea that I generally think of mindfulness as I'm focusing only on this moment. And they say, yeah, this moment, that's broken down into 3 other types of moments. So really, again, breaking it down as far as you can go. The rising moment is the moment as it's about to come in. The enduring moment is right here in this specific moment at this time, and the passing moment is as it's floating away. Again, we go back to looking at nanoseconds. I mean, this is really hard to notice something rising, enduring, and passing, at least in a moment. When you think about feelings, it starts to make more sense. I can feel the anger building, I know I'm angry, and now I can feel it passing. One of the great things to do is mindfulness will help you that when you feel the anger coming, breathing through it, noticing it, recognizing it, where do I feel it in my body? That's all the things you do during that enduring moment of the anger. And then you start to notice it starts to go away. I'm less angry with each exhale. So the other part of this 3 types of the moment is a reminder that everything is temporary and fleeting. Nothing is permanent, nothing will last forever. I think this is the reason why psychology really liked this idea. Because when we're talking about people who really are having a hard time managing their emotions, it's really helpful to remember this is not going to last forever. No emotion, whether good or bad, can last forever or neutral. They all come and go. Helping people understand that, realize that, and recognize that helps people give a whole lot more control over themselves and say, I can do this. I can endure this. I can get through this. It's not going to last forever. So that's where psychology, I think, started with it. The one technique they use is called ride the wave, and that's just the idea of, like a wave in the ocean that breathes in and out, everything will subside. So it comes up, it crests, it hits the top moment, and then it comes down again. So if I'm in the throes of anger or sadness or feeling judgmental or whatever it is, if I wait, it will go away. I just have to ride it out. And if I wait long enough, hopefully I won't do something stupid in the meantime. That's the ultimate goal. So the physical effects of breathing, I always thought, we use deep breaths as a coping skill, and it sounds really hokey. It sounds kind of dumb. And then I tell all my clients, no, there's scientific evidence that proves this. Let me tell you this. Then they're more willing to try it. So as we breathe in, our diaphragm actually pulls down. And it gets everything in the body to slow down. So the heart, getting less oxygen now, starts to slow down. You notice when you're in that moment of feeling really rushed or angry, your heart's beating faster and faster. You take a deep breath, the heart is forced to slow down. When the heart slows down, the brain gets the message, hey, everything's okay. The heart's not freaking out anymore. And the brain is your central command center. It sends the message to everyone else. Everything's okay. We don't have to freak out. Everyone can calm down. Now your muscles are relaxing, your legs are relaxing, you're feeling better everywhere. The tension in your head starts to drain. So taking deep breaths really does help physically people to calm down. So that's, again, why psychology started using it, and it seems to work. We've also found that there's wonderful effects on the brain. Obviously, we've talked about, Jon Kabat-Zinn has talked about his mindfulness-based stress reduction technique. And a lot of people talk about meditation working for decreasing anxiety and stress and, just a general, it'll make you feel better. Here's the why of that. In our brain, whenever we have a situation that we don't know or is new or frightening, our amygdala responds. That's our fight, flight, or freeze center of our brain. And in that moment, we react. Again, that nanosecond of, I'm scared, I react. What breathing helps us do is it buys us a little bit more time and meditation to elongate those gaps so that the amygdala then sends the message to the hippocampus, here's what happened. I got scared. So the hippocampus says, okay. The hippocampus then detects what the threat was. It figures out what it is, then sends the message to our front brain up here, the prefrontal cortex, and says, here's what you should do about it, or here's what it is, and then that part decides what to do. So one example, I have an exaggerated startle reaction. You can say anything to me and I'll freak out. So I thought about if a balloon popped, I would probably jump out of my seat and scream. Because my amygdala says, it's a threat, you're gonna die, and my body reacts, because I have that immediate reaction. Then my hippocampus shows up and says, dude, that was a balloon popping. And it sends the message to my prefrontal cortex, says, okay, nothing to worry about, we're all fine. So my amygdala thinks a tiger is after me, and by the time it gets to the front of my brain, I've already made myself look like a fool. Through meditation, as we elongate those gaps, I have more time for the information to process through my brain to make a decision before I react and say something really stupid. When I work with kids, I often talk about this as the rabbit brain versus the turtle brain. So the rabbit brain is your emotional brain. It will always get there really fast. If you take deep breaths, count to 10, eventually the slow little turtle will make its way up there and say, it's okay, everything's fine. And then you can make the reaction you want instead of screaming at a balloon. So a lot of people talk about how when they're meditating, they start to notice, I don't react as much and everything seems calmer and easier and I'm not as bothered. This is why they're learning to elongate those gaps so that their brain can work more efficiently. All right, the second foundation of mindfulness is feelings. So Buddhism talks about 3 types of feelings: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Seems pretty straightforward. They also make note that all feelings, as we said, are constantly changing. Nothing is permanent. Feelings arise from sensory contact with other things. So if I'm touching this table, I'm having a sensory contact of this is smooth. That, then I also consider what conditions are going on in my state of mind. So thinking about the balloon again, when I hear that noise initially, the pure awareness is just the noise in my ear. That the vibrating of my eardrum, that's the pure awareness. How I react is going to depend on my state of mind of, am I a startly person or not, which I am? Is it a loud room or a quiet room? If it's really loud, I might not notice that a balloon popped. If it's really quiet and it's dead silent and I'm taking a test, probably going to react a little bit more. So our feelings are really dependent on the situation of what's going on. I may not be bothered by the balloon if I'm having a good time at a loud party, or I might be really upset if I'm trying to concentrate really hard. So it's the same situation, but my feelings are different. So thinking about pleasant and neutral feelings seems pretty easy. We can handle that, right? That's not really hard. Dealing with unpleasant emotions or feelings, that's a lot harder to understand and to deal with. So there was a story I read about Buddha, of course, and one of his enemies threw a rock at him and it hit his foot. So in that moment, you imagine you can scream, you can yell, you can curse, you can say all sorts of names. Who is this guy? What's wrong with him? Buddha did none of that. His physician came, cleaned the wound, put some ointment on it, and the entire night, it hurt a lot. And he used mindfulness to say, I will endure this pain. He didn't focus on how bad he felt, how angry he was at the guy who threw the rock, what's wrong with the people, why wasn't anybody protecting me. He just said, the pain is the pain. That's it. This is my foot. This is here in the moment. I just have to deal with it. Thinking about all those other things is not going to make it any better. So Marsha Linehan, who was using mindfulness for her psychotherapy, said pain is pain. It just is. It is what it is. Pain without the acceptance of pain is suffering. So when I decide that this hurts and I'm mad about it, now I'm suffering both emotionally and physically. I can make it a lot worse by saying, yes, my foot hurts, and I'm mad at the person who threw the rock. I'm mad that somebody didn't protect me. I'm mad at the rock for existing, and why did God make rocks, and why is this one so sharp? We're always looking for somebody to blame because it makes us feel better. If I can just blame someone and it can be their fault, then I don't have to take that responsibility and own it as my own. But that's also what leads to the suffering. So when we talk about the real versus the unreal, it's this idea of not accepting things as they really are. In pain, in this moment, the reality is the physical plane. The reality of living on the physical plane and being here in the unreal is that it's going to hurt sometimes. Bad things are going to happen. We're going to be uncomfortable. If I want to believe that shouldn't happen, I'm just going to increase my suffering. From the Buddhist perspective, if I'm clinging to this idea that I should always be healthy and comfortable and happy, I'm going to be suffering. So suffering comes from this idea of clinging and wanting something other than what it really is. And then it gets confusing because now I'm talking about accepting reality, and 5 minutes ago I was talking about the real being something different, not on the physical plane. So it's important to kind of make that distinction and understand when psychology talks about accepting reality, reality is here on the physical plane. When theosophy talks about real, we're talking about the spiritual plane and not the physical plane. So the whole goal with mindfulness in regards to psychology specifically is to move from the unendurable agony of the experience to endurable pain, as Buddha was able to endure having an injured foot for the night. Okay, so one of the great skills that Marsha Linehan came up with was making a pros and cons list, which seems really straightforward. And if we're talking about meditating, what are the pros of meditating? What are the cons of meditating? Seems easy. But she also added on the other side, what are the pros of not meditating? And what are the cons of not meditating? So to really think about the pros of not meditating, there's some reason, some benefit I get out of not doing it. What do I like about that? And what am I giving up by not doing it? That's a way to really identify what are those barriers that are in my way that keep me from actually taking this step and making this a part of my life. Radical acceptance is one of her hardest and yet most important skills that she came up with. To me, it really embodies the idea of impermanence and non-attachment as focused on in Buddhism. The concept says that given the way things are, everything should happen exactly as it should be. So being able to accept that things are this way because that's how they have to be. One example would be if two cars are driving towards the same intersection and they're following all the traffic laws, they're going the speed limit, they're following all the signs, no one's doing anything wrong. And yet there's no stop sign at either intersection, those cars will hit each other if they happen to be there at the exact same time. It's neither driver's fault, but everyone's going to get out of the car and be angry. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? If someone gets injured, now their families are angry, the community is angry. The reality is that was exactly supposed to happen because of how it was set up. This is a really hard concept for a lot of people to kind of grasp, especially when it's not fair. When something's not fair to them, how can I understand that it still has to be that way? So one example I thought of is whenever we go to see our nephews, we usually get sick. And it would be so easy to blame everyone else and say, I shouldn't have gone to the party, they should have wiped their nose better, you know, their parents should have done something, they shouldn't be sick, what's wrong with the school system? You know, we use too much antibacterial soap and it's society's fault, now we're all immune to it. The reality is kids carry germs. And if I'm not around kids enough and I don't take precautions to wash my hands or make sure that I'm not touching their Kleenex or whatever, I'm gonna get sick. That's just what's gonna happen. Blaming a 3-year-old for coughing in my face is not gonna help anything. This is just what it is. I need to endure it. So through mindfulness, I can endure being sick for a week or however long and not be angry at my 3-year-old nephew. So again, that helps me kind of get to those ideas of accepting the situation, non-attachment. I don't expect that I'm always going to be healthy all the time. I don't have to be healthy. Health is something that will come and go in the world. Now I don't have to suffer and have a cold. So our third foundation is mindfulness of mind. Buddha talks about this in the 2 Kinds of Thought Sutta, which I thought sounded really weird. I don't know. But I looked it up. That's really what it's called, 2 Kinds of Thought Sutta. So what he did was he noticed that his thoughts really came in 2 categories. And then he tried to separate them into 2 different categories. The first category, let me see. No, that's not what I wanted. The first category was those that are clinging to sensuality, ill will, and harmfulness. The other category was thoughts that are renunciation, non-ill will, and harmlessness. So whenever a thought arose in him, he could put it into one of these 2 categories. As he started to notice thoughts of sensuality, ill will, or harmfulness, he then noticed these thoughts will eventually create harm to myself, to others, or to both of us. When a thought arose of renunciation, non-ill will, or harmlessness, he noticed this will not cause any effects, negative effects to myself, to others, or to both of us. So he started to realize, I want to cultivate the second category of thoughts and eradicate the first category of thoughts. Because what you focus on, thoughts become your habits. If you've studied at all about Annie Besant in thought form, she says the same thing. Like attracts like. So if I'm walking around in a big cloud of depression, all the other people who are also feeling sad for themselves are going to be drawn to me. If they're having a negative thought, I'm going to pick up on it. Whereas that other person over there having a good old time, it's just going to fade by me. I'm not going to notice it. So we find and we're attracted to things that make sense to us that we're already feeling. So when we have these certain thoughts, they become habits, they become actions. This is how we live our life. So he wanted to say, if you want to have good actions, you need to have good thoughts. He then took it further to talk about karma and rebirth. Your life here and now in this moment is a consequence of your thoughts and actions from a previous life. So your thoughts and actions that you do right now are going to affect your next rebirth. So you can determine what kind of rebirth am I going to have based on how I'm thinking and acting right now. If I want to give in to those thoughts of ill will and harmfulness and sensuality, I will have a lifestyle of that next time I come around. If that's what you want, that's okay. So this idea was that negative thoughts yield negative actions, but also negative actions yield negative thoughts. So if I'm going to think all these positive things, but I'm still going to go do negative things, that's incongruent. Eventually, my thoughts will come in line with the negative things. So I need to be really focused on what I want to be able to follow through on that. He also says, though, that you can't just get rid of your negative thoughts. You need to replace them with something else. And that spoke to me very loudly because that's the one thing we learn about in cognitive behavioral psychology. That is what you do. You can get rid of all these negative thoughts, but you have to replace them with something else. Okay, not there yet. So there's a cognitive behavioral therapy was kind of created in the 50s. As I've read about thought forms, I noticed there's a lot of overlaps in there. Again, that's a lecture for another day, but it's very fascinating to compare the two of those as well. So the basic formula for cognitive behavioral therapy is interrupt, challenge, replace. So when a negative thought comes into your head, say, no, I don't want to think about that. Challenge it to see if it's true. Replace it with something else. So to make this more practical, we think somebody cuts us off in traffic. And my first thought is that idiot. So I interrupt, no, I don't want to think that. I don't want to go down the road of anger. Challenge the thought. Is he really an idiot? I don't know. I don't know what's going on in his car. Maybe he's a cop and I don't know what he's doing. Maybe his wife is in labor and he really needs to get to the hospital. Maybe he's really late for an appointment and I'm not. That's kind of looking at the law of exceptions. What other possibilities could there be that make him not an idiot? Then I'm going to replace it. You know what? I'm fine. No one got hurt. Everyone is safe. Moving along my day. So now I've just taken a moment where I was so angry, I was about to, well, probably not, but I wanted to ram my car into him. Instead, I'm thinking, I'm safe, everyone's fine. This is not going to go with me through the rest of the day. So I thought, okay, what would Buddha do? How do we apply this to Buddhism? And it made sense to me. So Buddha would notice this thought of harmlessness comes into his consciousness. Whatever the thought may be, he notices harmlessness. Then he's going to challenge the thought. Could this thought cause suffering for someone else, myself, or both of us? Yes, it could. Then I'm going to replace it with a different thought, the thought of harmlessness. So it still actually fits into the exact same model of noticing the negative thought, seeing if it's going to cause harm, and replacing it with something more positive. So the whole point of, the mindfulness of mind and cognitive psychology is you have to get rid of all those negative things that plague you down, and then you have to replace them with something else. So it's not enough to just renounce, renunciation, all those things and have nothing left. You've got to build up a new life for yourself too. Our last foundation of mindfulness is Dharma, which is basically the truth and the way. This one's really kind of hard to talk about because it's very abstract and not very concrete and not as connected to psychology in that sense. But really it kind of describes the path to enlightenment. Psychology obviously is not aimed at enlightenment, so it doesn't really connect up here. But when talking about the Dharma, they talk about the 5 hindrances, the idea that clinging to things is what causes suffering. So if I'm clinging to the idea that my foot should not hurt, it's going to hurt even more. If I'm clinging to I want to live a long life, I'm going to feel even worse when I might get sick. If I'm clinging to the idea that I love cake, I'm going to have a really hard time realizing I can't eat gluten anymore. And I'm going to suffer ever more and more. So really, clinging is what causes suffering. In psychology, we say acceptance, being able to accept that things are as they are and moving on with that. The mindfulness of Dharma also talks about 10 perceptions that come up once you have eliminated these hindrances and all the clingings. Then they have 7 factors of enlightenment. They talk about the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So a lot of stuff in there that I'm not going to bother going through all of it because that alone is pretty dense to think about. And it's really when you get to that point where you're ready to move past your ego and break it down and move towards enlightenment, then you'll get there. Most of us are on the other side of just trying to get through daily life. So trying to control our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions so that we can get through. So I'm not going to go too much into all of that. So you can come and back to this aspect of it when you're really ready to move forward with it and you have a good control over your mind and your ego. So the big difference that I noticed though in this idea is that specifically this Eightfold Path is that Buddhism suggests there is one way. There is an absolute truth. There is something you're supposed to be attaining. There is one way to live life, or a best way. And psychology works so hard to say everything is okay, everything is acceptable, there's so many different ways to do it. Psychology works hard to say there is no objective truth. And that's one of the first things they teach us in school is no matter what somebody's telling you, it's not true. Don't get caught up in this idea of who's right or who's wrong, because none of it's true to begin with. It's all just a reflection of their experience and their feelings. And then we've got Buddhism over here saying there's absolutely an objective truth, and that's what we should be striving for. So again, we look back at that U-shape of we have to come down into matter to understand, break down the concept of truth. Here on this physical plane, there can never be objective truth. It's not real. It's called the unreal. Nothing here can ever be absolute. When we can fully understand that concept and break it down and get out of this I'm right, you're wrong, and embrace there's no objective truth, then we're ready to start on the path towards real truth and go to the real. So it seems backwards, but it definitely makes sense that we have to come down into ego, break it down, realize that none of this is real, so that then we can move forward and evolve out of matter. All right, so I have 3 quick techniques that I put up here. The first one is matching your inhalation to your exhalation. So in psychology, they call this 4 square breathing because that sounds cool. But what you do is you would inhale for 4, hold it for 4, exhale for 4, and then do that 4 times. That's 4 square breathing. if you just simply inhale for 4, exhale for 4, and keep doing that, and it doesn't have to be 4, it could be 6 or 8 or however long is natural for you, your heart will start to slow down, it'll become regulated, and your body will relax. We had the HeartMath people come in here, and they brought in their fancy equipment and everything, and that was the one thing I noticed. If your inhalation matched your exhalation, you would have 100% on your heart rate. I forget what the word they used. But that's all you had to do. So they're teaching all these great things, like all you gotta do is just practice simple breathing, and it worked. The second one is doubling the length of the exhale. So you inhale for 4, exhale for 8. That's really hard sometimes to do. Exhaling for 8 is really long, but it's another way to go about it. The full body scan is what Fernando had done with us back when he was here, where you start at your bottom of your toes, you notice your big toe, you notice your other toes, you tense them up, then you relax them, notice the balls of your feet, all the way up to the top of your head. By the time you get through with that, you're feeling a whole lot more relaxed. So that's a good one to do right before bed, especially if you're having a hard time sleeping or just feeling really stressed out or nervous. Full body scan does help. The other benefit, and what we do in psychology, is you can notice, where do I feel tension? Do I feel it in my stomach, in my chest, my throat, my head? And as I'm able to notice that, then I can use mindfulness to kind of investigate. Where is this coming from? What is the feeling behind this? What am I really thinking about? And then I can start to let it go. So the full body scan can be used in a couple different ways there. So mindfulness now, as we kind of talked about, it's this ancient tradition that's 2,500 years old, and now psychology is using it to deal with daily life. And they use it really as just a technique to manage our emotions every day. Then you can move forward and start going towards enlightenment if that's your goal. Otherwise, you can stay managing your emotions. That's plenty fine. That's enough of an accomplishment there. So the great thing that I really liked about it was it can be practiced by anyone. Even if you're just starting out or you're a person who can't even control their basic emotions. I mean, if you look at someone who's just a total mess, mindfulness will still help them. And then you look at a Buddhist monk who's been meditating for 20 years, mindfulness will help them. So it's one of those practices that you can start and keep with you always. So to me, it's a great place to start, and then as you go, you can learn other meditation techniques for other purposes. But I think it's pretty great, lots of science behind it.
So mindfulness is one of the Eightfold Path.
Okay.
It's one of 8. So it's in the context of 7 other things.
Right.
Which and psychology has 7 other things in which
we have a lot more than 7.
So that's one point. The other thing is there really isn't any conflict between Buddhism and psychology as far as there being no objective truth. Buddhism doesn't believe in an objective truth either. It believes in a non-objective truth, which is, well, it's beyond subject and object.
Right.
So there is not really a contradiction between Buddhism and psychology.
Right, and I wouldn't say there's a contradiction either. So, but that's a good point if it wasn't coming across clearly. I think really psychology just makes it more practical for the everyday living person. And then Buddhism takes it to say, this is a way of life that you can attain something higher. So there's something that can be gained from this besides just getting through the day. Where psychology is not going to suggest that there's any sort of truth beyond getting through the day.
Well, mine was more of a comment than a question, but when you're talking about building up the ego, and then once we have it, breaking it down, kind of reminds me of the process I kind of went through learning to write music. You learn all these rules and you look at how these other people did it, and and you practice within these bound lanes. And then when you try to ultimately do it yourself, all that stuff just goes away. It's broken down. Everything's, all those rules are gone, but somehow something remains that enables you to move forward.
I've heard that same idea with writing or, making movies, that you learn the rules so you can break them. And it is that same idea of learning how to do it the right way, so that then the science part of it, learning how to make it up, how to put it all together, so that when you get to the art aspect of it, you can kind of surf on your own and put it all together. So that brings up, is meditation an art or a science? And that would be something that could easily be debated. Psychology has a little bit of science behind it, but there's definitely a lot more you can do to make it your own.
Yeah, there may also be some confusion about the terms if you go to the real subtle meaning, in the sense that, from the spiritual point of view, not so much from the psychological point of view, everybody has an ego. If you think that you are this person in your body, emotions, and mind, everybody has already an ego. The problem is that some of them are healthy,
Right.
some of them are unhealthy. So it would be more a question of getting the ego healthy before you can take the next step. So it can be seen also that way, and not just building and destroying.
Right. And that's a good way to put it, that psychology is trying to help you be a healthy person, to make right choices, to understand relationships, to get along in the world, whereas a lot of people do make unhealthy choices and decisions. Mm-hmm. And if you tried meditating at that point, it would be destructive. Mm-hmm. So that's why we talk about ego strength. I mean, that's the psychological term of having a strong ego, of being able to control it, know yourself, separate yourself from somebody else, to know their bad mood is not mine, to know you're different.
Would the psychological term of self-actualization sort of coincide with enlightenment, or are they related at all? Or
yeah, I was talking about that the other day with someone who was looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and said, I think I'm self-actualized. I said, oh no, that's like Buddha and Jesus. They get to be self-actualized. I think Maslow really said it was like 5% of people reach self-actualization, but most of us are stuck below in the love, need, belonging stage. So yes and no. I think enlightenment might even be a step beyond that, because I don't think 5% of the people have attained Buddha status. And he might have been a little, him and his friends might have thought, we're pretty good. So it's close. It's getting there. It's the closest psychology will get to the concept of enlightenment. We'll say that.
It's interesting to me that with mindfulness, you can also, when paying attention, you can also build your health, your strength as an ego, but then also use the same process to attain that spiritual place a little more fully.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating that it's all about health, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's one reason I love it, that you can use it from beginning to end, and it never becomes unrealistic.
And just to start, being awareness is the first, I find the first step, awareness of attachments. Mm-hmm. And when I know aware of attachments, and then the process can be letting go.
Right.
Yeah, so.
That's like level 5 advancement. So you're doing really well.
One of the things that I think about when I think of mindfulness also, maybe going a little bit different direction, but at the same time, is active listening, or being right there and with what's happening at the time. And because most of us, instead of having a conversation, are waiting to say something.
Right.
And we never listen to what is said. They say that if most people hear 5% of a conversation, they're lucky.
Right. Yes, I could definitely believe that. And it's really that idea of, once I'm able to understand what's going on inside of me, I can be open to understanding what's going on inside of you. So when you say something, I can recognize the feeling that comes up in me, and I feel tense, and what's that about? Instead of just thinking, how can I defend against that or prove you wrong? what do your words really mean to me? And that's what we should be focusing on. That's part of the active listening. Definitely helpful in most relationships.